It was just another average afternoon in the small suburban town of Brooksville. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Kids rode their bikes down the street, and the sound of lawnmowers hummed in the distance. Inside a modest two-story home on Maple Street, a 12-year-old boy named Ethan was finishing up his schoolwork. He had been eagerly anticipating this moment all week. His new PlayStation 5 had arrived just yesterday, a gift he'd been saving up for months, scraping together birthday money, lawn mowing earnings, and even doing odd jobs for neighbors. He had spent countless hours dreaming about the first gaming session, imagining the epic adventures he would embark on with his new console. Ethan's parents worked long hours, so the house was often quiet, giving him plenty of time to immerse himself in his favorite games. His older sister, Lucy, was away at college, and his younger brother, Noah, was in a different room, probably playing with his Legos. So it was a rare moment of calm as Ethan unboxed the 5 pounds, carefully setting up his new system in the corner of the living room. He marveled at the sleek design of the console, his heart racing with excitement. It wasn't just any console, it was the PlayStation 5, a coveted treasure that he had admired from afar ever since it was released. But just as he powered it on, the doorbell rang. Ethan paused, confused. Who could be visiting at this time? He glanced at the clock, just past 3 p.m., and opened the door to find Karen standing on the front porch. She was in her mid-40s, a neighbor who lived a few houses down. At first glance, Karen seemed harmless enough, a middle-aged woman with a wide smile who always seemed to be meddling in other people's business. She was known in the neighborhood for popping by unannounced and for asking people for favors. Everyone had learned to tolerate her presence, but no one really got close to her. "Hey, Ethan." Karen greeted him cheerfully, as if they were old friends. "How's your mom doing? I was wondering if I could borrow a cup of sugar for my cookies. You know how it is, I was planning to bake for the neighbors, but I'm all out." Ethan was about to say yes when he realized that his PlayStation was just behind him on the coffee table. He had been so engrossed in his setup that he hadn't heard Karen's footsteps approaching. Sure, just give me a second," Ethan said, trying to act normal. He stepped into the kitchen, grabbing the sugar and handing it over without giving it another thought. But as he turned to go back to his room, he noticed something odd. The living room was too quiet, almost too still. He had left the 5 pounds in plain sight on the coffee table, but now it was gone. Ethan froze in place, his heart skipping a beat. He walked back into the living room, his mind racing. Where could it have gone? He checked the surrounding area, under the couch cushions, but the 5 pounds was nowhere in sight. That's when he saw Karen, standing at the front door, her back turned to him as she began to walk away, carrying something bulky under her coat. It was unmistakable there, hidden beneath her jacket, was the 5 pounds. A cold, uncomfortable realization hit Ethan like a ton of bricks. He felt his pulse quicken and his stomach twisted into a knot. Karen had taken it. Before he could even process what had just happened, he rushed to the door, swinging it open to confront her. "Hey, you took my 5 pounds. His voice cracked as he yelled at her. Karen turned around, a look of feigned surprise spreading across her face. "Oh, I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't think you'd mind. I thought you'd be upstairs. It just looked so nice, and I wanted to try it out for a minute," she said with a strange, nonchalant tone, as though what she had just done was perfectly reasonable. "No," Ethan shouted, stepping forward, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "That's mine. You can't just take it." Karen raised her hands in mock surrender. "Calm down, Ethan. It's just a game console. I'll bring it back in a bit. No need to make a big fuss." But to Ethan, it wasn't just a game console. It was his dream come true, the one thing he had worked tirelessly for. And now it was gone. He stood frozen in place, the weight of the situation sinking in. Karen's calm demeanor only made the betrayal sting even more. She was leaving with his most prized possession, and no one was taking him seriously. As she walked away, he rushed to close the door behind him, slamming it so hard that it rattled in its frame. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he felt the anger boiling inside him. This wasn't just about the 5 pounds. It was about the complete disregard for his hard work, his effort. He had always been taught to trust people, to believe that if he did the right thing, things would go his way. But now his faith was shaken. Ethan stood there for a moment, eyes glued to the door, wondering what to do next. Should he call his parents? The thought of explaining the situation to them made his chest tighten with frustration. They'd probably laugh it off, thinking it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. This was his moment of triumph, stolen away by someone who didn't care at all. He had to get it back. Determined, he took a deep breath, grabbed his phone, and dialed his mom's number. As he waited for the call to connect, he couldn't help but think about how everything had changed in an instant. What started as a regular day in a quiet neighborhood had now turned into a nightmare. Ethan sat down on the couch, phone still pressed against his ear, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. His mom answered the phone, her voice soft and comforting. "Hey, honey, what's up?" But even before he could respond, he felt his anger flare again, and the words seemed to catch in his throat. He tried to explain what had happened, his voice shaky as he stammered. "Mom, Karen, she took my 5 pounds. It's gone. She stole it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, Ethan? Are you sure she took it?" his mom asked, a mix of confusion and concern in her voice. "Yeah, I saw her with it. She was holding it under her jacket like it was no big deal. She's just walking away with it like it's hers." Ethan's words tumbled out faster, his frustration spilling over. "I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She said she'd bring it back. But I don't trust her. I want it back now." His mom let out a deep sigh. "Honey, I know this is upsetting, but let's try to stay calm. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Maybe she didn't mean any harm." Ethan felt his heart race in his chest. He could hardly believe his mom wasn't taking him seriously. "This is serious," he thought, clenching his fists in frustration. It was more than just a misunderstanding. It was theft. And no matter how calm his mom tried to sound, it wasn't going to make him feel any less betrayed. "Mom, this isn't just a misunderstanding. It's my 5 pounds. I've been working so hard for it, and now it's gone." "I understand, Ethan," she said, but her tone was still dismissive. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We'll talk about it when I get home. I'm sure everything will be okay. Just relax for now, all right?" Her words only made the anger inside Ethan burn hotter. He wasn't going to just sit around and wait for her to get home and talk about it. He needed to take action. Now. He hung up abruptly, not even giving her a chance to finish her sentence. For a few moments, he just sat there, staring at the door, thinking. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if time had frozen. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should he call the police? Should he go over to Karen's house and demand it back? But what if that only made things worse? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let this go. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. His younger brother Noah ran in from the yard, his face flushed from playing outside. "Hey, Ethan, what's going on?" Noah asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's Karen," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. He was so worked up, it felt like there was a knot in his chest. "She took my 5 pounds. She stole it." Noah blinked in disbelief. "What? Are you serious?" "Yeah, I'm serious. I don't know what to do. Mom doesn't believe me, and I don't think anyone will do anything about it." Noah stood there for a moment, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Wait, did she take it while you were on the phone with Mom?" "Yeah," Ethan said, voice tight with frustration. "I called Mom, and she didn't take it seriously. I need to get it back, but I don't know how." Noah looked down at the floor, thinking. Then his face lit up with a sudden idea. I could tell Dad. He always knows what to do when someone's being unfair. Ethan gave a small, bitter laugh. Dad's busy with work. Besides, it's not like he's going to drop everything to chase after Karen and get the £5 back. Mom thinks it's no big deal. Well, maybe she just doesn't get it. Maybe I should go over there myself. No, said, his voice firm with determination. Ethan stared at him, surprised by the confidence in his younger brother's tone. You're just a little kid, no. What could you do? I don't know, but I'm not just going to sit here. I'm going to help you get it back. Ethan looked at Noah's small face, the mixture of innocence and determination. He felt a sudden rush of pride for his little brother, but the weight of the situation still lingered heavily on his shoulders. He knew that Noah couldn't fix this, but maybe, just maybe, his little bit of optimism was something Ethan could hold on to. All right, Ethan said, standing up. We'll figure this out together. But we need to be careful. I don't want to make things worse. The two of them quickly gathered their thoughts and formulated a plan. Ethan felt a strange sense of urgency now, his body buzzing with adrenaline. He couldn't sit idly by and wait for Karen to bring back the £5, nor could he simply accept that it was gone forever. He had to act now. Ethan made up his mind. It wasn't just about the £5. It was about standing up for himself. No one could just walk into his home and take something so precious without consequences. He grabbed his jacket, pulled on his shoes, and with Noah at his side, headed out the door. As they walked down the street toward Karen's house, Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what he would say or how he would convince her to give it back, but he was sure of one thing. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. The neighborhood, usually so quiet, now felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension. With every step, Ethan's thoughts flashed to the moment when he had seen Karen leaving with the £5, her smug smile as she casually walked away with what wasn't hers. That image fueled his determination as he approached Karen's front door. The confrontation was coming, and there was no turning back now. As Ethan and Noah reached the front door of Karen's house, a knot formed in Ethan's stomach. The quiet neighborhood that had once seemed like a safe haven now felt foreign, tense, even menacing. Every step they took felt heavier, the air thick with a mixture of dread and determination. Ethan glanced over at Noah, who was unusually calm for his age, walking beside him with a quiet confidence that, in that moment, seemed almost out of place. Noah was younger, but his belief in standing up for what's right was something Ethan had always admired. Yet, despite his brother's bravery, Ethan still felt an overwhelming weight pressing on him. They were about to confront a woman who had just stolen something so important to him. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the fear of how Karen might react gnawed at his insides. They reached the door, and Ethan hesitated for a split second, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell, trying to steady his nerves. The seconds felt like hours as they stood on her porch, waiting. Noah was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure she's home?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, she's home. I saw her this afternoon, right after she took the £5. She's probably just waiting for us to forget about it." Just as he finished speaking, the door opened, revealing Karen standing in front of them. She looked surprised but quickly masked it with a fake smile, as if she had been expecting this moment. Well, if it isn't Ethan and Noah," she said, her tone too sweet, too rehearsed. "What brings you boys over here today?" Ethan took a step forward, ignoring the polite pleasantries she was trying to offer. "Karen, I know you took my PlayStation. I saw you walk out with it earlier. I want it back." Karen's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of guilt cross her face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by an expression of feigned innocence. "What are you talking about?" she asked, acting as though she hadn't heard him. "I haven't taken anything from you, Ethan. Maybe you're just confused or upset." It's a big world out there, you know. Ethan's anger flared. No, I'm not confused, Karen. You walked into my house and took it. It's mine, and I want it back. He took another step forward, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Don't play dumb with me. I know what I saw. You took it under your coat and walked away like it was no big deal. Karen crossed her arms, a smug smile creeping onto her face. Ethan, you're being ridiculous. I don't know what you think you saw, but that £5 was just sitting there, unused. I'm sure you don't really need it. It's just a game. You can live without it. The dismissive tone in her voice made Ethan's blood boil. It was as if his hard work didn't matter, as if his dreams weren't worth anything. This wasn't just about a stolen £5. It was about being disrespected, about having his efforts belittled by someone who clearly didn't care about what he'd gone through to get it. I do need it, Karen. You don't understand. I worked so hard for that. I saved up for months, did everything I could. And now you're just taking it like it's nothing. Ethan's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of everything he had been feeling coming to the surface. You can't just walk into someone's house and take their things. Karen rolled her eyes, as though Ethan was overreacting. I'm sure it's not as important as you think it is, Ethan. It's just a thing. No, it's not just a thing. Ethan's voice rose. It's mine. You don't get to just take what you want because you think it doesn't matter to me. The air between them crackled with tension. Ethan could see that Karen was starting to grow defensive. Her smile faded, and she shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. But instead of backing down, she dug her heels in, trying to assert control over the situation. Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but you're mistaken. You need to leave. Ethan's heart raced. He could see that she wasn't going to give in easily, but he wasn't about to walk away empty-handed. He glanced at Noah, who stood next to him with an unusually steady expression. Despite his younger age, Noah had a sense of determination that was almost unnerving. Ethan could feel his younger brother's presence as a source of strength. With that silent encouragement, Ethan squared his shoulders and made his next move. I'm not leaving without it, Karen, he said, his voice firm, his resolve growing stronger with every passing second. I don't care if you call the cops. I'm not leaving until you give it back. Karen's face tightened, and she let out a small laugh, as though she thought he was joking. You think you can just demand it back from me? You think I'm going to let you walk in here and take my stuff? Ethan could feel the anger bubbling inside him, but he refused to let it control him. He took a deep breath, trying to focus. This isn't your stuff, Karen. It's mine. I know it's here. Just give it back. Karen paused for a moment, her face hardening as she sized up Ethan. Then, after a long silence, she gave a resigned sigh. Fine. If you're so sure about it, come inside. But don't expect me to just hand it over without a fight. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment of truth. He stepped forward, Noah right behind him, ready for whatever came next. But as they entered the house, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had no idea how this was going to end, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He was going to leave with what was rightfully his, no matter what it took. As Ethan and Noah stepped into Karen's house, the air felt heavier, thicker with every step they took. The front hallway was dimly lit, with old family pictures lining the walls, showcasing a picture-perfect life that felt completely at odds with the woman who stood in front of them, dismissing Ethan's concerns like they were nothing. They followed Karen into the living room, where the very £5 Ethan had worked so hard to earn sat perched on the coffee table, looking almost out of place in the otherwise tidy, overly curated space. Karen's demeanor had shifted as soon as they crossed the threshold, her previously feigned cheerfulness replaced with a more guarded, calculating air. She moved toward the couch, sitting down with an air of indifference, as though this were all just another minor inconvenience she could easily dismiss. She gestured to the console. There, it's right where I found it. You want it back, huh? Ethan's stomach twisted in knots, the frustration boiling inside him, but he kept his voice steady. "I want it back, Karen. I'm not going to leave here without it." His heart was pounding in his chest, each word feeling more important than the last. Karen raised an eyebrow, her fingers tapping on the arm of the couch, her posture relaxed in a way that only added to Ethan's unease. "You're being dramatic, Ethan. You're telling me you want to get all worked up over a game console. It's just a thing." Ethan clenched his jaw, the words stinging more than he expected. His entire body was tense, but he forced himself to keep his composure. "It's not just a thing. It's my thing. You don't understand what it means to me. You have no right to take it." Noah, who had been standing quietly behind Ethan, spoke up, his voice unwavering despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Yeah, it's his. You can't just take people's stuff. You need to give it back." Karen shot him a sharp look, almost as if she hadn't realized Noah was there. She hadn't been expecting anyone to stand up to her, let alone the kid. But instead of backing down, she simply smirked. "What are you going to do about it, huh? You two really think you're going to make me give it back? I've had a rough time lately, and maybe I deserve a little something nice. Maybe it's your turn to give someone else a break." Her words stung like ice, leaving Ethan momentarily speechless. Deserve something nice? His blood ran cold as he realized just how skewed her perception of the situation was. She wasn't remorseful. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was justifying her actions, trying to spin the situation in a way that made her feel justified, as though taking from someone else was a form of self-care. "Deserve," Ethan echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. "You think you deserve it after just taking it from me? No, Karen. It's not how it works. You took something that doesn't belong to you, and that's wrong." The silence in the room felt suffocating. Ethan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the anger coursing through him like electricity. It was one thing to be dismissed by an adult, but it was another to have someone try to invalidate his feelings and his hard work. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not now. Not ever. Karen watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, she leaned back into the couch. "You really think this is worth it, huh? All this drama over a video game?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the £5, sitting there so innocently on the coffee table, taunting him with its gleaming white surface. It was his. He had earned it. And no one, least of all Karen, had the right to take it from him. He knew what he had to do next. His voice was lower this time, but there was no mistaking the firmness behind it. "I'm not leaving until I get it back, Karen. You can call the cops, but I'll tell them exactly what happened. And you're not going to get away with this. I won't let you." Karen's gaze narrowed, her expression darkening slightly, but she didn't move. She just stared at him, sizing him up, perhaps deciding whether this would be worth escalating further. Then, with a sudden motion, she stood up from the couch, as if to make some sort of gesture to end the conversation. She reached for the £5 and placed it in her hands, her fingers tightening around the console's edges, like she was preparing to keep it from him. "I don't know what you think is going to happen here, Ethan, but you're not getting it back." "Not like this," Karen said, her voice suddenly colder, more threatening. Ethan took a step forward. "Give it to me, Karen. Now." For a long moment, nothing happened. The tension between them was palpable, almost suffocating. Karen stared at him with a hard look, her fingers twitching slightly on the £5. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on him. This wasn't just about a game anymore. This was about something deeper. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it got. And then, unexpectedly, Karen broke the silence. "You want it that badly?" she asked, almost in disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom why anyone would fight so hard over something so insignificant in her eyes. Her voice wavered, just slightly. "Fine. Take it." Ethan blinked, surprised by her sudden capitulation. He was ready for a fight. But this was different. Karen's voice held an almost reluctant edge, as though she was giving in, but not without resentment. She slid the 5 pounds across the table toward him, her face unreadable. For a moment, Ethan was frozen, unsure whether to take it or not. The feeling of triumph was almost anticlimactic. After all the anger, all the tension, all the fear that had built up in him, he thought it would feel different. But when he reached for the console, holding it in his hands once more, he realized something. This wasn't about winning. It was about the principle, the lesson he had learned about standing his ground, about not letting anyone take something that belonged to him, no matter how powerful they seemed. As he stood there, the weight of the 5 pounds in his hands, he felt a sense of relief, but also something deeper. The fight had taken something out of him, something he couldn't quite name. But one thing was certain. He wasn't just walking away from this with his 5 pounds. He was walking away with a lesson in how to stand up for himself. And he wasn't about to forget it. He turned to Noah, who stood by his side, watching the entire exchange in stunned silence. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silent bond between them stronger than ever. And then, without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of Karen's house, the 5 pounds secure in his hands, the weight of the world finally feeling a little lighter. The door shut behind them, and they made their way home. It was over. But the questions, the lingering thoughts of how things had escalated, stayed with Ethan. Was this really the end? Had he made the right decision? He didn't know yet, but one thing was for sure. Nothing would ever feel the same again. As Ethan and Noah walked back down the street, the weight of the 5 pounds in Ethan's hands felt heavier with each step. The relief of having the console back, of having regained what had been wrongfully taken, slowly started to wear off, replaced by a gnawing unease. The excitement he had initially felt, the joy of finally holding the 5 pounds again, was now tainted by the events that had just unfolded. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just between him and Karen, but within himself and the neighborhood around him. The confrontation had left him unsettled, and the emotional toll of the entire situation began to sink in. What had started as a simple misunderstanding, a mistaken judgment by an overbearing neighbor, had escalated into something much bigger. Ethan knew that while he had walked away with the 5 pounds, it wasn't the end of the story. Karen had lost something too. Her sense of control, her standing in the community, and Ethan couldn't ignore the possibility that the consequences of her actions would ripple through the lives of everyone involved, especially in a small town where everyone's business seemed to become everyone's problem. As they reached their house, Ethan saw his parents' car pull into the driveway. His mother, still looking concerned but now slightly more alert, stepped out of the car. Ethan's father, a quiet man who usually kept his distance from neighborhood drama, followed her. Both of them looked at him, his hand holding the 5 pounds, a mixture of curiosity and confusion written on their faces. Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure of how to explain what had happened. Before he could say anything, his mom spoke first. "Ethan, what's going on? Why do you have the PlayStation?" Ethan took a deep breath. His mom had clearly seen the tension in his face, the way he carried the console like it was the last thing he wanted to hold. But he knew the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. "Mom," Karen took it. She stole it." His mother blinked, processing the words. "What? Why would she do that?" Her voice was filled with disbelief. Ethan explained everything. How Karen had walked into their house under the guise of asking for a favor, how she had taken the 5 pounds right in front of him, how he had tracked her down and demanded it back. The more Ethan talked, the more his mom's expression shifted from confusion to concern, and then finally to frustration. His father stood silently by the door, arms crossed, but his eyes were narrowed, a rare expression of interest crossing his face. "You went over there and confronted her?" his father asked quietly, finally breaking his silence. Ethan nodded, his stomach still in knots. Yeah, I had to. She wasn't going to give it back on her own. His father looked at him for a long moment, and then his gaze moved to the 5 pounds, held tightly in Ethan's hands. And you think that was the right thing to do? I don't know, Ethan said, his voice cracking a little. I couldn't let her get away with it. She took something from me, something I worked so hard for. There was a long pause before his dad spoke again. I get it. I really do. But sometimes, Ethan, you have to think about the bigger picture. What happens now? How do you think Karen's going to react? How's she going to treat you from now on? Ethan swallowed hard, realizing the gravity of what his father was saying. He had been so focused on getting the 5 pounds back, on taking what was his, that he hadn't considered the long-term consequences of his actions. He had confronted Karen, stood up for himself, but now he had to face the reality that the situation wasn't as simple as winning a fight. He had damaged something between them, something that might never be repaired. Before he could respond, his mom spoke again. What happened between you two wasn't just about the 5 pounds. It was about trust. People don't just walk into someone's house and take their things. And Karen, she's not going to let this go. There's a bigger issue here, and it's not going to be resolved overnight. Ethan felt the weight of her words, but there was still a part of him that couldn't completely let go of the sense of justice he had felt. He had done what needed to be done. But now he was forced to confront the consequences of that decision. What would people think of him now? Would the neighbors who had once been so friendly see him as someone who had made a scene, who had escalated a simple misunderstanding into something far more divisive? And what about Karen? Would she hold a grudge? Or would she eventually realize the mistake she had made? Over the next few days, Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. At first, the gossip seemed benign, just people exchanging stories about what had happened. But soon, it became clear that the situation had become a source of division in the community. Some people supported Ethan, empathizing with his frustration and sense of justice. But others were more sympathetic to Karen, who had painted herself as the victim, claiming she had simply been trying to help Ethan's family and had made an innocent mistake. Ethan couldn't escape the tension. Everywhere he went, neighbors would stop and offer an awkward greeting or glance his way with a raised eyebrow. He could feel the eyes on him, the sense that he was now part of a drama that everyone was watching. Even in school, the story had spread, and some of his friends joked about it, but there was an undertone of discomfort. It was as if the community was now fractured, caught between two sides, and Ethan wasn't sure where he stood anymore. The fallout wasn't just about the 5 pounds. It was about trust, power, and what it meant to be part of a community. Ethan had learned a harsh lesson about the consequences of standing up for himself, about how sometimes the right thing to do wasn't always the easiest or the most straightforward. He had gotten his PlayStation back, but at what cost? As the days turned into weeks, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the bigger picture. Had Karen learned anything from this? Had he? He wondered if there was a way to repair the damage done, to rebuild the sense of community that had once been so strong. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that things might never go back to the way they were. The trust that had been broken between him and Karen, and between him and some of the neighbors, might be too deep to mend. Still, as time passed, Ethan found himself growing, evolving. He became more aware of the choices he made and the impact those choices had on the people around him. He realized that standing up for himself didn't always mean confronting someone head-on. Sometimes, the most difficult decisions were the ones that required patience and understanding. The hardest lesson of all was that justice didn't always come in the form of immediate action. It sometimes meant understanding the consequences of what came next. In the end, Ethan had gotten his 5 pounds back, but he had gained something far more valuable than just a gaming console. He had learned that standing up for what was right came with a price. It wasn't always clear-cut, and the road to resolution could be messy. But at least now, he understood the complexities of justice and the importance of choosing the battles that truly mattered. And as he sat down to play his games again, the feeling was different. It wasn't just about the victories on screen anymore. It was about the ones he had fought in real life. And those, he knew, were the ones that would stick with him the longest. The weeks that followed the confrontation with Karen were a mix of reflection, quiet tension, and unexpected growth for Ethan. As the initial shock of the incident began to wear off, he realized that the aftermath had left him with far more questions than answers. The 5 pounds, once the object of his dreams, no longer held the same weight in his hands. It had become a symbol of something far more complex than just a game console. It was a reminder of the cost of standing up for what was right, of the emotional toll that came with confronting someone who had wronged him. The victory of reclaiming it felt hollow in the face of everything that had come after. Ethan found himself questioning whether the way he had handled the situation was truly the best course of action. It wasn't just Karen he had to think about either. His relationship with his parents had shifted as well. At first, they had been distant from the situation, not fully understanding the gravity of what had happened. They had been so busy with their own lives that they hadn't noticed how much the theft had affected Ethan. When he had tried to explain the emotional weight of the situation, they had been slow to comprehend. But over time, they began to see the bigger picture. They realized that Ethan hadn't just wanted the 5 pounds back. He had wanted to stand up for himself, to prove that he wasn't just a kid who could be walked over. They started to understand the depth of the frustration that had led him to act the way he did, even if they didn't fully agree with his methods. Their relationship became more open, more communicative, and Ethan found himself talking to them more about his feelings and his struggles. His parents began to offer advice, not from a place of authority, but from a place of understanding. They still didn't fully grasp the intensity of what had transpired with Karen, but they were there for him, in ways that they hadn't been before. And then there was the neighborhood. The once tight-knit community was no longer the same. There were still those who supported Ethan, who saw the injustice in what had happened and admired his determination to fight for what was right. But there were others, those who had sided with Karen or who were just too uncomfortable to take a side, who now kept their distance. The gossip had spread like wildfire, and the division was palpable. Some neighbors gave him a nod of acknowledgement when they saw him, but it was always followed by a quick turn of the head, as if the situation was something that couldn't be talked about openly. Others went out of their way to avoid him, their once friendly smiles now replaced with awkward nods. Ethan couldn't escape the sense of being an outsider, even in his own neighborhood. One evening, as he sat on the front porch, trying to process the weeks that had passed, he saw Karen walking down the street. Their eyes met for just a second, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it guilt, regret, or was it something more complicated, like understanding? He didn't know. He had expected to feel victorious after reclaiming the 5 pounds, but all he felt now was a strange emptiness. He had won, yes, but the cost had been high. In that moment, he realized that the outcome hadn't brought him the sense of satisfaction he had imagined. There had been no grand revelation, no immediate sense of closure, just an ongoing sense of uncertainty. Karen's eyes shifted away from his, and she continued on her path down the street. But Ethan noticed something. She didn't look as smug or self-assured as she had in the past. She seemed smaller, almost defeated, and for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of sympathy for her. It was a strange feeling, one that didn't sit easily with him. She had taken something from him, something that he had earned. And yet, standing there watching her walk away, Ethan realized that there was more to the situation than he had initially understood. He had seen Karen as an antagonist, someone who had wronged him, someone he had to defeat. But now, looking at her from a distance, he saw that she too had her own battles, her own struggles that had driven her to make the choices she had made. That didn't excuse her actions, but it gave him a new perspective on what had happened. In a strange way, he began to understand her. It was a tough lesson, one that Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to learn. It wasn't just about standing up for himself anymore. It was about empathy, about understanding that sometimes people acted out of pain or desperation. Sometimes people didn't do the right thing because they didn't know how or because they were dealing with their own internal struggles. And in that moment, Ethan realized that even though he had fought for what was right, he could also show a little compassion. The next few days were filled with introspection. Ethan spent more time reflecting on the consequences of his actions and how the neighborhood had changed since the incident. He began to understand the deeper lessons that had come from it all: the importance of empathy, the complexity of justice, and the realization that standing up for what was right didn't always lead to the expected results. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could change how he approached the world moving forward. In the weeks that followed, things began to settle down, though the air was still thick with the remnants of what had transpired. Ethan and Karen never spoke directly again, but he saw her less and less around the neighborhood. The tension between them remained, but it was no longer as sharp as it had been. It wasn't perfect, but things had started to heal, slowly. Ethan understood now that sometimes healing wasn't a clean, straightforward process. It was messy, it took time, and it often left scars. But it was possible. At school, Ethan began to rebuild his sense of self, no longer defined by the confrontation or the outcome of it. He focused on his friends, his family, and his passions, gaming, of course, but also new interests he had discovered in the wake of everything that had happened. He had learned that the victories in life weren't always about what you gained or what you lost. Sometimes, the real victories came from the lessons you learned along the way. Looking back, Ethan could see that the 5 pounds had been just a catalyst, a way for him to realize something far deeper about himself and the world around him. It was a reminder that the things we fight for often carry deeper meanings than we realize, and the way we handle those fights, how we treat the people involved, and the lessons we take from them, shaped who we would become. As the seasons changed, Ethan felt a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. He knew that life would always present challenges, moments that tested his resolve, his understanding, and his compassion. But he was no longer the same boy who had stormed over to Karen's house demanding his 5 pounds back. He had learned that sometimes the most important thing wasn't winning. It was learning to navigate the gray areas of life, finding balance between standing up for yourself and showing empathy for others. And as he sat on his porch, watching the sunset with the 5 pounds beside him, Ethan realized that this journey had shaped him in ways he never could have imagined. It had taught him the value of standing his ground, but also the importance of stepping back and reflecting. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt ready to face whatever came next.